Hello, and welcome to the video. We have something a little different today. I know I say that a lot, but this is different. We're building a server. This is my personal server. It has a Xeon X3470. That's a Linfield CPU. It has 32 gigabytes of RAM and some random 500 gigabyte hard drive. It also has a GT710 in it to make the desktop experience mostly usable, because this is just running Windows 10. Today, we're going to fix that. Originally, I was going to upgrade this to a Sandy Bridge Xeon, an E3 1240. Nothing special, but it is a fairly significant upgrade over what was in that. However, our good friend Pefty Lefty, during the P.O. Box donation, donated something that I just could not pass up. So we're not going to be upgrading to Sandy Bridge. We're going a little further. We're going a little bit further. First things first, we have to get this old motherboard out. You might notice that I've added a fan to the top of the RAM there, and that's because this case has pretty poor airflow. In fact, I've taken the 5 1/4 inch bays in the front and added fans to those as well because, well, without them, I was cooking my components. Luckily, removal was pretty easy in this open case. There isn't a lot to worry about other than wires. As far as the cooler goes, I did have some trouble with this, but eventually, after enough digging through my parts bins, I was able to piece together enough Noctua parts to get something that could be mounted. I didn't have any fans or fan mounts, so I dug through my parts bin again, found a fan, and did the right thing and secured it with zip ties. It's not pretty, but it will work just fine. The CPU that we have to cool is a Xeon E5 2667 V4. Not a bad little CPU. 6 cores, 12 threads. A lot better than that ancient Linfield that I was using before with 4 cores and 8 threads. And it's just plain old faster, even in single core. Genuinely an excellent upgrade. Since this is a pretty basic upgrade, there isn't a whole lot to do other than put the new motherboard in. Now the box actually says that it's compatible with DDR3 and DDR4, but unfortunately after testing this, it only has DDR4 slots, and unfortunately there's a damaged pin in one of those slots. So I think we're just going to go ahead and stick with 2 sticks for now. I was able to test the server's functionality using the DDR4 that Pefty included, but those sticks are a little bit much for this server, just a bit of a waste since I'm never going to use that much. So it was off to Facebook Marketplace to get stood up 4 separate times before finally managing to bring some DDR4 home with me. And what we ended up with was 2 sticks of 16 gig. Totaling 32 gigs. Not bad at all, I'd say. This isn't going to be a super crazy server after all. Honestly, other than having some issues with Facebook Marketplace, and that's kind of just par for the course, really, this has been a pretty decent build so far. We haven't run into any dead hardware. Everything's coming along well. We're doing so good on time, in fact, that you're getting a double feature today. We're going to go ahead and install Windows on this machine now, and just so we can do some tests that are easy to digest, we're going to go ahead and run some games on this. But that's not all. Once we're done with the games on Windows, we're going to install Ubuntu on this machine and run many of the same games just to see the difference between the two. Because when this goes back to my work, I have a rack there that I can put this into, it is going to be running Linux. So, let's see how she does. Well, we are unexpectedly taking a little break from the testing because I just received a message from Pefty Lefty that says something's waiting for me in my P.O. box. I screamed, and then I went over there. We have we have a 0.5 terabyte SSD. This is now the largest SSD I own. That's pretty great. Is that NVMe? No, it's SATA. That's actually good. SATA is more compatible with a lot of these systems that I run into. And I've also got this. Survey says that's memory. Uh-oh. I may have purchased RAM for nothing, because this does not look like DDR3. This is a bit of an impromptu unboxing, so sorry about the... this one's... there we go. Sorry about the poor camera angle. What do we have? We have... 8 sticks of 8 gigabytes of what appears to be DDR4 ECC. Okay. Now there is one problem, and that one slot that has the bad pin in it. I might dig into that. You know what? Let me get a needle. I know it's probably really hard to see, but this is kind of the best angle I can get to try and show what I'm talking about. I couldn't find a needle, but right there, see that little piece of gold? I think that's a pin. Now I've got this X-Acto knife. It's not ideal for this, but we're just going to gently run it across. Wait a minute. Was that just a piece of debris? Was that really just a piece of debris? At this point, I decided to test it to make sure that we weren't going to have any unknown issues, and I installed the first 2 sticks, booted into Windows just fine, so filled out the rest. Not bad. Plus, we went from a total of 32 gigs up to 64. Again, I cannot say this enough. Thank you very much, Pefty. Well, there you have it. There's no reason for me to use the DDR4 that I picked up when I could use this. Pefty, thank you. Thank you very, very much. But still kind of wondering what the heck that shiny gold fleck was. It did not blow away when I tried to use compressed air or that new blower with it. Just wouldn't budge. But either way, it seems to be working now. Also, I did confirm it does say DDR3/DDR4, but that's only DDR4. So I'm not crazy. It did say that. So either way, let me finish getting the games tested. I'm actually gonna... It really shouldn't matter. What speed was this anyway? DDR4 3600, but you know what? I probably never set the speed in BIOS, so this was probably running at standard DDR4 2400. Maybe even 2133? I don't know DDR4 speeds. I don't use this stuff. This is too new for me. But anyway, I am very happy about this. Thank you so much. I cannot express my gratitude enough. Anyway, let's, this time, actually get to testing. We are starting with a slightly different game than usual. This time we're starting with 7 Days to Die. And the main reason we're starting with this is to test world generation. I remember back in the olden days when it would take 10 to 20 minutes just to generate a world, and find it's full of these weird comb textures in the land that you just couldn't pass through. Or just missing chunks entirely. Nowadays, it is a much smoother experience, and if you get the chance to play this game, I do highly recommend it. In this case, in 4 minutes and 31 seconds, we not only have the entire world generated at maximum size and increased POIs, but we have the preview done as well, and honestly, for some weird reason, kind of reminds me of something else. Kind of reminds me, now that I'm looking at it, it kind of reminds me of the Inner Sphere map from BattleTech. Huh. I might have to play this map. Anyway, we're not super interested in the actual gameplay of 7 Days to Die because it is very CPU dependent, but it's just kind of hard to run for some reason. It's not super well optimized even in the new patches. So, we are going to move on. We have moved on to one of my absolute favorites, and that's BattleTech. This is another relatively CPU-dependent one, as there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the backgrounds, and this doesn't happen all the time, but in between the turns, you will notice some stuttering if your CPU just isn't up to snuff. Graphics, not super heavy. But in this case, I have noticed there's very little stuttering when you're moving from turn to turn, and honestly, I'd say this is pretty good. I'm happy with this result. Moving on. Moving from one franchise to another, we've gone from BattleTech to MechWarrior. Honestly, I can't find anything wrong with how this plays. We're not at the supreme mega high settings, but it's up there. Yeah, I'm happy with this. And as one of my favorite games, we're going to end with Dark Souls 3. Another game that sees very little issues when running. Yeah, pretty happy with this. What's left? Well, Linux. Let's get that installed. Well, I messed up a little bit and didn't hit record when I was installing Ubuntu, but honestly, nothing happened. I chose all the default options. I had it install third-party drivers while it was installing. That's it. There's nothing else to talk about it. Just it installed the operating system. I do like Ubuntu. I know more about CentOS and by extension Rocky, but Ubuntu is one of the most popular Linux distributions on the planet. There are so many tutorials specific to Ubuntu. I bet you there's not a thing you can do with Linux that there isn't a tutorial for on Ubuntu. So, that's what we went with. Why am I using a graphical user interface? Good question. Because I can. So, there isn't really a whole lot more to say. I mean, the hardware hasn't changed. So we're going to go ahead and install Steam real quick. And if I run into any issues, I'll turn the camera back on. If I don't, well, the next thing you'll see is gameplay. Let's see which of those two scenarios plays out. Minor update. Lost my tripod. Second, right as I was getting ready to start testing games. Battletech had an update? Okay. Also, apparently the Steam install on Linux can just see my Windows Steam library, so hey, I didn't have to download anything. Anyway, looks like that's almost finished, so let's go ahead and see how these run. By the way, we're using the Proton compatibility layer. You can access that by just going to the Steam settings and compatibility if you're running Linux. Well, here we are. I did have some really strange issues. Unfortunately, it seems Battletech doesn't like when I'm recording. Because while I'm recording, we're getting the low teens for as far as frame rate, and responsiveness is just pretty terrible. But when I'm not recording, we're looking at mid to high 20s, so pretty similar to under Windows. Not the same, but reasonably similar. Moving on to the next game. Now this was interesting. The first time I tried to run MechWarrior 5, it wouldn't recognize my mouse inputs. A quick restart of the game did fix this though, and I was not impressed by the results. Now, to be fair, this game already barely ran under Windows, and under Linux, with all the extra overhead of, presumably, the Vulkan shaders for Proton. I could be wrong there, I'm not an expert at this, I don't really run Linux very often. It just can't keep up. We're looking at teens again for the frame rate, sometimes dipping into the single digits, and the input latency is, in some cases, over a full second between me clicking and something happening on the screen. So this completely unplayable mess. And before anyone judges this too harshly, I want to remind you this is the Windows install. We're using the Windows Steam library in order to save time. I'm sure this would be at least a little bit better if I had installed it under an actual Linux file system that didn't have any bloat left on it. I could be wrong. Maybe we should explore that someday. In the meantime, let's move on to the next game. Yes. Dark Souls 3. This played just fine under Windows, but it's barely playable under Linux. We're looking at single-digit frame rate, like, right off the bat. Not great. One of these days, when we make an actual Linux gaming machine, instead of a server that could potentially run some games, we might want to compare and contrast the different performances between Windows and Linux properly, instead of just, oh hey, the installs still work. We want to do this right eventually, but today is not that day. After all, this is going to be a server. We don't care too much about how it runs games. Honestly, I'm pretty happy with how that came out, even though the Linux gaming performance just wasn't really there. Now, there are a couple of things that could explain that. The first one is the fact that that was a second-hand install for all those games. Those were left over from Windows. So we're talking about a completely different file system that Linux can see and can use, but there is that kind of different directory structure and all that. It's just the little bit of extra overhead. There is also the fact that we're using a workstation card, and the drivers for this card aren't technically optimized for video games. Now, obviously, it can still run video games, and the Microsoft Display driver that was the default download on Windows, provided by AMD, does work pretty well for games. But I have my suspicions that the one downloaded for Linux might not be optimized for any games. It might actually work better for workstation tasks under Linux compared to Windows, while worse at games. I can't prove that, not without further testing. And to be quite honest, I needed this server last Monday. It is now Monday again, so I need to put this into service. Let me know if you'd like to see more Linux content on this channel. Let me know if you want to see more server content. In the meantime, thank you again, Pefty. I could not have built something quite to this caliber without your assistance. So, if you liked seeing this today, this shorter content, let me know down in the comments. Hit the like button if you feel like it. And let me know what you think about the voiceovers. That's kind of a new thing for me. This whole format, this shorter video is purely experimental. So let me know what you think, and maybe if we're lucky, we can do more of this in the future. I really hope this turned out well. If you'd like to see more content like this, please hit the subscribe button. I don't usually do servers, but I do have quite a few things kind of in the queue for what's up next, including a few exciting things. If you'd like to send me your old junk, we do have a P.O. box. There is the address in the description below. You can find a link to my Patreon down in the description below. That's where I post all sorts of behind-the-scenes content, exclusive videos, and all sorts of polls as well to let you vote on upcoming videos. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.